It is judgments of this sort that incline people to claim and others to deny that the work of people like Flanders or Wodehouse is art. But once all the relevant facts and distinctions have been set out, this is a dispute about labels, and nothing very much turns on it. Whether we call the songs or the books art or not, they are to be valued for certain sorts of reasons and not others. They are not deep and serious, but they were not meant to be. There are no great truths to be learned from them, but they can be clever and entertaining and even astute. Once all this has been said, there is no point in pressing the further question, but is it art? Cognitivism about art explains how it is possible for some creative works of imagination to be more profound than others, and why this matters. Depth and profundity are often taken to imply that more obvious values such as wit, entertainment, and enjoyment in art are to be denigrated or discounted. But this is an unwarranted implication. We can welcome the suggestion that there is more to art than the pleasure, without denying that pleasure is sometimes one of the things that makes it valuable. A properly normative theory of art, such as the aesthetic cognitivism elaborated here, is not intended to demarcate true art or art proper to the detriment of art that does not or cannot fit this description. It is meant to explain and justify a range of artistic appraisals, a range that is reflected both in judgments about particular works and in the cultural status accorded to art forms. A normative theory of art does not imply anything about personal taste. Whether one prefers the novels of D.H. Lawrence to those of P.G. Wodehouse, or thinks more highly of the music of Michael Tippett than Scott Joplin, is not to the point. What the theory explains is why, for example, there is reason to include the works of Lawrence and Tippett in an examinable curriculum, why there is something faintly absurd about writing a doctoral thesis on P.G. Wodehouse, as few people have done, and why Scott Joplin's music was suitable for entertaining film like The Sting. An adequate normative theory will also explain why such assessments are not the result of mere social or cultural prejudice. If it is true, as aesthetic cognitivism claims, that some works of art can be said to give us a deeper insight into human nature and human condition, then to rank them more highly than works of entertainment is no more puzzling than the fact that we attribute greater importance to crucial scientific experiments than to amusing or fascinating tricks that exploit a knowledge of top optics or magnetism. Science can be entertaining as well as art. It can require very high levels of expertise. It can have practical uses. But the greatest scientific achievements are those that have made fundamental contributions to human understanding. Aesthetic cognitivism of the sort espoused by Goodman wants to make precisely the same point about art. Art and human nature. Despite all that has been said, there might appear to be an important disanalogy between science and art. Scientific understanding has an object, the natural world or physical universe. This is what the scientists' theories are about. But we have yet to state clearly what artistic understanding is about. What is its object? The preceding paragraph gave one answer, namely, human nature and the human condition. Great works of art enable us to understand what it is to be a human being, not in the way that physiology, psychology, or anthropology do, but by providing images through which our experience may be illuminated. At this point, another possible objection arises. Cultural relativists will argue that concepts of human nature and the human condition are not fixed. Human nature, their contention goes, is not one thing for all humans at all times. Neither is the human condition. Different cultures understand these ideas differently. Consequently, they are concepts that cannot be given universal content, and so they cannot be construed as boundaries or fixed points of reference common to all members of the species Homo sapiens that we can aim to know or understand better. Legal systems are culturally relative. And what counts as art has certainly varied from time to time and place to place. It is questionable, however, whether this sort of relativism can be extended to such fundamental concepts as human nature and the human condition. This is because the human condition is made up of elements, at least some of which affect all human beings. Susceptibility to cold, hunger, and disease, the nature of childbirth, the existence of pain, illness, bereavement, and mortality. And the concept human nature can be confined to such things as interest in sexual relations, humor, sorrow, anger, pride, and so on. All of these provide the recurrent themes of songs, storytelling, and depiction in every culture. Besides, even if we were to agree that any treatment of these themes is always shaped by a specific cultural context, this would not undermine the cognitivist theory of art. For the theory to hold, it is enough that concepts of human nature and the human condition are to be found in some cultures. Then, relative or not, they may in those cultures provide us with the subject matter of artistic understanding. Perhaps it is true that the art of one culture cannot illuminate the experience of people from a wholly different culture. Despite their common membership of the same species. But this no more implies that no one is illuminated than the fact that English cannot be used to communicate with everyone implies that English speakers fail to communicate with each other. We can conclude that the cultural relativists' objection, whether sound or unsound, does not undermine the claim that art can be valued for its illumination of human experience. It is now time to turn from the general to the specific, and from the possible to the actual. Can the claims of cognitivism be made good with respect to all the different art forms? And can it be shown that cognitive enrichment is an actual and not merely a possible value? Literature seems the easiest case. Almost any major Shakespeare play, Othello, King Lear, Henry V, could be interpreted as providing insight and illumination on the themes of human nature and the human condition, as could novels such as George Eliot's Middlemarch and Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim. But can it be shown that absolute music without words can illuminate human experience. If it can't, is music less important than literature, to be valued only in terms of pleasure and or the expression of emotion? And what about architecture? Could the building of a temple or a palace be the construction of an image from which we might learn about the human condition? And if so, an image of what? In any case, do we need to give this explanation of its value when it is so obviously has another value, namely usefulness? The visual arts also seem to generate problems for cognitivism. Abstract paintings, for instance, does not seem to be composed of images at all. So do the performing arts. Could a dance be about human nature? These are all important questions. They need to be dealt with at length by the normative theory of art as understanding, which this chapter has elaborated. This is why the next 5 chapters of the book leave behind questions about art in general and examine specific forms of art in some detail. Summary. In this chapter, a version of aesthetic cognitivism has been explained and defended. This is the view that art is most valuable when it serves as a source of understanding, which in principle puts art on a par with science, history, and philosophy. There are evident differences between all these modes of understanding, but there are good reasons to hold that art contributes significantly to human understanding. In appreciating how it does this, it is essential to see that works of art do not expound theories or consist in summaries of facts. They take the form of imaginative creations that can be brought to everyday experience as a way of ordering and illuminating it. Aesthetic cognitivism explains more successfully than other theories why we do and should attribute to great works of art the value we do. Although there is pleasure to be gained from the arts and beauty to be found in them, and though they are often moving, these features alone cannot explain the value of art at its finest. The idea that we come away from art with a better understanding of human experience is able to make sense of this, but it is unclear whether the explanation of value can be applied to all the arts. So, we need now to look in more detail at specific art forms: music, the visual, literary, performing arts, and architecture. Chapter 5, Music and Sonic Art. Previous chapters examined the 3 principal ways in which philosophers have tried to explain the value we attach to art. The most successful of them, aesthetic cognitivism, is to be preferred in part because it can accommodate a wider range of valuations and explain more satisfactorily both the cultural status generally attributed to art as well as the discriminations we make between the serious and the light in art. Philosophy, however, is a critical discipline and cannot take conventional evaluations simply as given. Even the most widely held opinion can turn out to be faulty in some way once it is subjected to philosophical criticism. And this applies to beliefs about art as much as to moral and religious beliefs. So while established beliefs have much greater weight than mere personal opinions, there has to be a dialectical exchange between them and the critical principles of philosophical thought. Sometimes, as we shall see in chapter 10, philosophy raises very substantial doubts about things that are taken for granted. There are some facts about art, however, that any explanation of its value has to respect. These are the facts about different art forms. Music is a different medium from painting. Architecture different from drama, and so on. So different are they that the value of art is an issue that has to be investigated in a more detailed way in relation to each. The discussion up to this point has been concerned with the respective importance of pleasure, beauty, and insight in general. But perhaps some forms of art cannot have all of these values. This is why it is appropriate to move to an examination of 5 principal art forms: music, the visual arts, literature, the performing arts, and architecture. And in the light of the arguments of the previous 3 chapters, to ascertain what can be said about their value. Music and pleasure. There are several reasons for beginning with music. Music alone, sometimes called is indisputably one of the arts, and often regarded as art in its purest form. Consequently, any adequate explanation of the value of art must cover music satisfactorily. Second, absolute music very quickly calls into play the arguments of previous chapters. It seems undeniable, for instance, that absolute music can and does give pleasure. It is often valued for this reason. It is also widely regarded as a powerful vehicle for the expression of emotion, though it is problematic how and whether music can say anything. Many composers and musicians have attributed it to a power to reveal something about human life and experience. In musical analysis, music for which this claim is made is often called program music, in contrast to absolute music in the strictest sense. The aim of this chapter is to explore these three dimensions of music, beginning with pleasure. That music can and does give pleasure is not in doubt. The question is whether this is the only or best explanation of the value we attribute to it, because many musicians and music lovers claim to find more in music than simple pleasure. For instance, in a once very influential book significantly entitled The Language of Music, Derek Cook says this: "To put it in the contemporary way, the writer on music is expected to concentrate entirely on the form, which is not regarded as saying anything at all, instead of responding to music as it is, the expression of man's deepest self. We tend to regard it more and more as a purely decorative art, and by analyzing the great works of musical expression purely as pieces of decoration, we misapprehend their true nature, purpose, and value. By regarding form as an end in itself, instead of a means of expression, we make evaluations of composers' achievements which are largely irrelevant and worthless. People have a tendency to objectify their personal preferences and elevate their likes and dislikes to a higher level. It could be that when musicians and musicologists like Cook talk in these terms, they are simply expressing a preference, because this sort of language is rarely applied to jazz or rock music. Certainly, it is relatively rare for people to speak about music in the high-flown language of Cook. Nonetheless, in identifying what they like or enjoy about music, the range of terms employed quickly moves beyond simple pleasure. Music is described as moving, exciting, haunting, thrilling, and so on, more often described in this way than as pleasurable. More importantly, pleasant and nice can be used in ways that make them more negative than positive. To describe a piece of music as pleasant can be to damn it with faint praise, even when pleasant or enjoyable are used positively. They seem patently inadequate for pieces of music to which we want to give the greatest praise. No one would describe Beethoven's quartets as pleasant, or Mozart's Requiem as enjoyable. However, to note that the vocabulary people use about music is wider than pleasure and enjoyment does not show very much. Moving, exciting, haunting, thrilling are all emotional terms. Why should music not be pleasurable? Precisely because it moves us emotionally. Actually, this is probably the commonest view of music, that it pleases us deeply by expressing and stimulating our most powerful feelings. The combination of pleasure and emotion in an explanation of the value of music has considerable plausibility. It seems undoubtedly true that we can derive pleasure from the emotional impact that music has upon us. Nevertheless, there are some important differences between pieces of music that could not be accommodated in this way. One of the most striking is complexity. A major composition such as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony has a great deal more to it than a simple melody like Greensleeves. And at least part of the difference lies in the complexity of the music. Beethoven's symphonies have a scope and scale far beyond that of the average popular song. This difference in complexity is of considerable importance in assessing the merits of a piece of music. To handle the huge forces of a symphony orchestra satisfactorily, as both composer and conductor, requires a very great mastery of musical materials. Yet, from the point of view of pleasurable feeling, there does not seem any reason to prefer or commend this mastery. The complexity in a piece of music does not, in and of itself, lead to greater pleasure on the part of the listener. On the contrary, since a large-scale piece of music demands a great deal from us in the way of sustained and concentrated attention, simple harmonies with a catchy tune are usually much easier to enjoy. Complexity is an intrinsic feature of music. By locating the principal value of music in the pleasure it gives, we shift attention away from the music itself and on to the listener. In so doing, we naturally come to regard its affective capacity, its ability to move us, as its most important property. But, of course, music also has a structure. Every piece of music of any sophistication is a construction out of certain variables: melody, harmony, rhythm, and form, together with the timbre and texture of sound created by the different sounds of instruments and voices. It is the task of the composer to unite these in interesting and attractive combinations, and great composers do so in ways sufficiently complex to allow both understanding and analysis. Any assessment of a musical composition must take account of its intrinsic structure as well as its effect upon the listener. A highly sophisticated piece of music, such as Elgar's Cello Concerto or Brahms' Violin Concerto, not only is worth listening to, but requires listening over and over again. This is not simply because we can enjoy it more than once, but because there is more and more to discover in it. It may also be performed again and again in markedly differing ways, because it allows considerable variety of interpretation. A musician can use an instrument or an orchestra to explore a piece of music and to reveal the results of that exploration to the audience. This is not true of all music. There is a great deal of very pleasant and even affecting music that is simple and straightforward from the point of view of both the listener and the performer. Then some pieces of music are richer than others. They contain more of interest than initially more attractive and indeed more pleasurable pieces. Were we to confine ourselves to estimating the value of music in terms of pleasure, even pleasurable feeling, we could not capture the relative structural wealth or poverty that is to be found in different styles and pieces of music, and upon which the judgments of critics and musicologists are based. The songs that ABBA produced are genuinely pleasurable in a way that a lot of symphonic music is not. But this does not make them better music. Boccherini's Minuet is a very pleasing sound. Beethoven's Kreutzer Sonata is not. Nevertheless, the second is obviously a superior piece of music. We can only consistently hold both these judgments if we can explain the value of the Kreutzer without having openly or surreptitiously to appeal to deeper or higher pleasures. The most straightforward way of doing this is to appeal to relative intellectual complexity. Music is not just an undifferentiated sound which may or may not please. It has a structure which lends it interest and consequently value. And great music exploits structural possibilities to a degree that puts it far beyond the level of simple, pleasant melodies. It does not merely have an effect upon us, as the melody does, but provides us with material for our minds. Music and emotion. To counter the simple, perhaps naive view that music is valuable chiefly as a source of pleasure, by appealing to structural complexity, might be thought to construe music too abstractly. It is true that music can sustain intellectual analysis, but it is also has affective properties that should not be ignored. To make structure the principal focus of critical attention is to leave out precisely what most people would suppose to be an essential element in music appreciation, namely the ability to be moved by it it seems possible that someone could analyze the form and structure of a piece of music and at the same time feel no sympathetic response to it. Such a person might have some understanding of the piece as a composition, but could not be said to appreciate it as music, because what is missing from a purely analytic understanding is the very thing that most musicians and music lovers hold to be peculiarly valuable in music, namely its emotional content. This argument could be strengthened in the following way. Let us agree to reject the pleasure view on the ground that good music offers us structural complexities that we hope to understand intellectually. But what are these structures for? Complexity, for its own sake, is not something we have any reason to value. Serial music, invented by Schoenberg, is built around an immensely complex system of composition, which is intellectually demanding to master as composer and listener. But it has largely been abandoned because the complexity does not seem to have a good enough payoff in terms of music worth listening to. Atonal music has some enthusiasts still, but has never been satisfactorily incorporated in the repertoire that draws audiences. Serialism is a subject to be returned to at greater length, but for the moment, its relative failure will serve to show that structural complexity is not to be valued in itself. Indeed, music can be criticized precisely for its mere complexity, as serial music has been. The value of structural complexity lies in what it enables a musician to achieve, namely musical effect. No purely formal property has value in music. In fact, undue complexity of structure may undermine the very emotional experience aimed at, as arguably it does in some of the music of Telemann. There is plainly something correct about this line of argument. The idea that mere complexity increases value must be wrong. Though whether mere complexity is possible in music is debatable. However, even if it is true that complexity in music is only valuable so long as it serves some further end, it does not follow and is not obvious that this further end must have something to do with emotion. To be more precise, it is not obvious how emotional effect or content as the end at which musical complexity aims could help us explain the value of great music. This is partly because of the general difficulties about art and emotion rehearsed in chapter 3. But there is this further great difficulty. Despite the implicit assumption so far, it is hard to see how there could be any connection between emotion and music at all. People often and easily say that music is filled with, or expresses, or arouses emotion. They do so because it is unquestionably true that we can use emotional terms to describe pieces of music. Indeed, some pieces of music are such that it seems impossible, to avoid the language of emotion if we are to say much about them. Elgar's Cello Concerto is one particularly marked example. Michael Hurd, Elgar's biographer, describes it as filled with sadness and regret, and shot through with melancholy. And these are descriptions that anyone who has listened to the piece, especially the third movement, will find it hard to resist. Conversely, it seems entirely appropriate to describe the rondo in Mozart's Fifth Violin Concerto as irrepressibly happy in tone. There is just no better way of describing it. The application of emotional terms to musical compositions and performances, together with the established practice among critics and musicologists of doing so, is what inclines people to believe in a special connection between music and emotion. However, there is an important logical gap here. The application of terms is a fact about linguistic behavior, not a fact about music. Expressivism in music moves from the former to the latter and bases a belief about the nature of music on a fact about the use of language. Is this move justified? Does the ease and regularity with which emotional terms are applied to music imply that music expresses emotion? There are a number of reasons for thinking that it does not. The first is this: if we try to specify the emotions with which a piece of music can be filled, which it may arouse or which it could express, the list turns out to be surprisingly short. Music is said to be sad or happy, or some variation of these general terms. Somber and joyful, for instance. It can also, as we noted, be exciting or haunting. Very few other emotional states or conditions can be ascribed to music without a measure of absurdity creeping into the discussion. Possibly, it makes sense to say that music can arouse or even express pride as well as sadness, happiness, and excitement. But it hardly makes sense to speak of music expressing shame or embarrassment or envy or hatred or shyness or boredom or revulsion or any of a great many more emotional states that human beings experience. Even love is not something that can have obvious musical expression. Of course, there can be love songs, but these have words whose power to express all sorts of emotion is not in question. What is in question is the power of music alone, absolute music. To do this, insofar as the language we use to describe it goes, we would have to conclude that at best it can do so only for a severely limited range of emotions. The second difficulty for musical expressivism is this: emotional content is supposed to help us avoid pure formalism about music and to explain why complexity is to be valued. This implies that greater complexity of construction facilitates greater emotional expression. But is this true? It seems not. Asked to name the quality of a simple minor chord repeated in common 4/4 time, even very young children will say sad, whereas a combination of melody and harmony that has a relatively complicated time signature, Dave Brubeck's Take 5, for instance, is not easily identified with the expression or evocation of any emotion at all. If now we combine these 2 points, that the range of emotions it is possible for music to express or evoke is extremely limited, and that the ability of music to evoke this limited range of emotions does not seem to have any obvious connection with complexity, and add them to the earlier arguments of chapter 3 about art and emotion in general, then music will seem of little real value. That is to say, if what is important about music is its ability to express or arouse emotion, and it is this that gives musical complexity its rationale, then music cannot claim to be much importance. This is an unwelcome conclusion to arrive at. But in arriving at it, we have leapt the same logical gap that expressivism does so by assuming that the applicability of emotional terms to music shows music itself to contain emotion. But the mere fact that the same terms are applied to music as are applied to human moods and attitudes does not show that those terms share the same meaning in both contexts. This is a point that Roger Scruton makes. The ways of hearing sound that we consider to be ways of hearing music are based on concepts extended by metaphorical transference. Metaphorical transference is sometimes called analogical extension, the extension of language from one context to another by analogy. it is not just the language of emotion that is extended in this way. A clearer example is the extension of the language of vision to the world of sound. So easily does this take place that it may take an effort to appreciate its oddity. Music is a strictly aural medium, yet somewhat surprisingly, it is often described in terms that have their home in strictly visual contexts. The sound of brass is described as bright, for example. The stops on an organ are said to give it color, and the tone of a cello or an alto voice referred to as dark. The same sort of analogical transference happens in the opposite direction. Colors are commonly described as loud or soft. This example is especially useful because no one is tempted to leap from these facts about the use of language to conclusions about the nature of sound and vision. To try to measure the volume of a loud color, for example, would reveal a gross misunderstanding. Everyone acknowledges loud and soft can be applied to both noises and colors, but we do not infer from this that, despite being wholly different media, sound and vision have common properties. On the contrary, just because they are wholly different, we have reason to think that the same terms have different meanings when applied in such different contexts. Similarly, though tunes and harmonies are frequently described in emotional terms, sad, happy, and so on, there is nothing in this fact alone to support the idea that music has emotional content. On the contrary, since pieces of music and states of mind are so very different, there is reason to think that the use of emotional terms in music is another case of analogical extension. Actually, such extension reaches back into the description of emotional states themselves. For here two terms can be used whose home is some quite other context. The American philosopher Arnold Eisenberg once pointed out that we debate about whether light-hearted can be applied literally to a piece of music. But it is no less puzzling what the literal meaning of light-hearted is when applied to human beings. In this particular case, the original home was a long abandoned physiological theory with no modern equivalent. And this shows that at least some of the words we use to describe emotional states are metaphorical extensions without any residual literal meaning at all. So far, we have been thinking of emotion as the content of music. An alternative would not open to the same objection is to think of music as expressing the emotions of those who compose or play it. Music is never literally sad, but what we call sad music arises from the mind of the composer, which is literally sad. This is a view to which many people are drawn, and it is possible to find examples that it seems to fit especially well. Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony has 4 movements rather than the more customary 3. The third movement finishes in a cheerful and vigorous style, and then we are plunged into a 4th movement of great somberness. No one listening to it could fail to agree that Hauntingly Sad is an accurate description. Commentators have frequently attributed this 4th movement to Tchaikovsky's increasing despondency, and indeed he died shortly after its completion, his death being widely believed to be suicide. This seems a perfect example for the thesis that music expresses the emotion of the composer. However, the example is instructive in a different way. Recent scholarship suggests that Tchaikovsky's despondency was lifting when he wrote his Sixth Symphony, and that he may not have committed suicide at all, but died in a typhoid outbreak. The important point to make, however, is this: it does not matter which account of the last days of his life is true. The music remains the same, and the description, hauntingly sad, continues to be appropriate.